All right, welcome back. We told you it'd be a quick break. Quicker than expected. Why wait, right? We got smart people that are going to come and talk to us about their perspectives. As I said, right, we've laid the foundation with remarks from Mike and Isabel, and now it's a pleasure to welcome a dynamic group of thinkers, leaders, and educators, right, who are confronting the issues that we heard about. I am also delighted to welcome the Dean of the School of Education and Human Services here at OU, an entity that trains teachers, puts them into the field, and we couldn't have this discussion without having in mind that next generation that we're preparing here at OU. So it's a pleasure to have Dr. John Marjoram Lays come up and seat the panel, introduce the panel, and I'll turn it over to the Dean. Thanks very much.
Well, welcome to Oakland University. And Dave Dulio, thank you very much for your introduction. As Dave said, we prepare a lot of teachers here. A little over 5,000 teachers in Southeast Michigan have degrees from us, and we're very proud of the work that we do. I wanted to thank Bridge Magazine for the reporting that they've done and the questions that they've raised. And of course, I wanted to thank the Center for Civic Engagement and the Galileo Institute for Teacher Leadership, who are co-sponsoring this. And it's a great day at Oakland University. And most days are great days at Oakland University, which is a good thing. So let me introduce our panel briefly. They're to my right, your left. Armin Harachin is the Executive Director of Teach for America, and he's been with them since 2018. He's partnered with a talented team and community leaders to expand the organization's reach and deepen its impact across Michigan. Under Armin's leadership, Teach for America Detroit has grown from 30 teachers in 2018 to more than 800 educators today. And that's quite an accomplishment. By the way, I'm introducing these folks alphabetically in case you're wondering. Dr. Kimberly Leverett is the superintendent of the Pontiac Schools, and she has been in education for over 30 years as a teacher, a coach, a principal, and a district administrator. She's recognized for her commitment to equity, inclusion, and building sustainable systems that enable students to thrive. An accomplished leader, Dr. Leverett has earned multiple awards for her impact in education and is author of the book Powerful Resilience. Third, Dr. Dan Quinn, on your far right, is the Chief Strategy Officer for Public Policy Associates. He leverages his experience in public policy, organizational management, and education. Dr. Quinn is also a social studies teacher with 20 years of experience at the secondary level. And last but not least, Mike Van Beek is the Director of Research at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He's been with the Mackinac Center for quite a while, since June 2009 as their Director of Education Policy. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you for being here. Those of us in the room, if you could have a brief round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much. So let's get to it. I have 4 or 5 questions to ask you, and no particular order, so we'll just kind of ping pong this. We heard a lot from Isabel and Mike. They gave us a lot to think about, but one of their main points was that while a lot of people are working hard and working towards the good, we don't seem to see the test scores moving. We don't seem to see improvements, particularly around reading and math. And those scores continue to slide. And so I wonder if each of you could unpack that a little bit from your perspective. Why is that? We're doing all of this work, we have choice, we have some funding, and yet the scores continue to slide.
Thank you, Dr. John. I'll take that first question. What I would say, and the conversation that I continue to lift in every room that I'm in, is we cannot have a conversation about academics without talking about the social, emotional learning component of that. So there is a multi-tiered system of support, and part of that multi-tiered system of support talks about where our students are socially, how are we meeting their needs, when they come to school. So that is one of the challenges that we're facing. And I will say that in Pontiac, we have recently identified a 5-year strategic plan. The first part of that pillar is academics, but the second pillar, it's around social emotional learning, because we are experiencing, yes, we are beyond COVID, but we have some long haulers and we have some children as well as staff in our community that have experienced traumatic events over and over again. So how do we lay that out and provide those supports along with academics and staying the course with our reading and our math? And I heard the young lady from My Bridges talk about the letters training. How do we implement the professional development and making sure that our staff gets everything that they need? But again, from our perspective, I really do believe that one of the challenges that will continue to be part of this narrative is the social emotional aspect that goes along with that, and really having a strong multi-tiered system of support. So what does that look like when we talk about the whole child and we talk about pre-K through 12, college, career, and beyond? We cannot have those conversations without bringing up what those components embedded in a multi-tiered system of support looks like. That is what has been our experience in Pontiac, and that's what we have started to do, is really lay the foundation for how do we support the student academically, but how do we support the social emotional needs of our students.
I guess add to that, one of the missing voices on here is the voice of an active teacher. I think having teachers in the room in policy discussions is a needed conversation piece. While I was a teacher for 20 years, I have not been a teacher since COVID. I have basically been told that you haven't been a teacher if you haven't been teaching since COVID. And there's a drastic distinction that has been made from that point. My wife is a classroom teacher, and she can almost to the point say where a kid was when COVID happened, and each one of those years since then, the needs have changed. If someone was a second grader when they entered school during COVID, their experience was different than a seventh grader. So as we think about where we are, each year we've had to make changes along the way. And I think the social emotional piece is a key component that we need to pay attention to.
For me, part of the reason why Michigan's school test scores are still sliding and not improving, I'd point to two things: implementation and accountability. We passed similar laws to the ones that they used in Mississippi that were part of, I don't think it's everything that explains their incredible performance over recent years, but they implemented those policies. We didn't do that here in Michigan. We passed a law and hoped that it would get implemented. And the other side of that is accountability. School districts, we have to hold them accountable for performance. We don't do that very well now, and we'll need to do that in the future if we want to get better results out of our public school system.
We know that educating kids is a really complex endeavor, and that complexity is all the components around a child, right? Dr. Lever, you just shared social emotional. We know kids need to be able to eat well before and after school. They need to show up healthy. Access to transportation. We have this chronic absenteeism issue, right? If parents aren't well, kids are going to struggle, right? And focused curriculum, materials, great educators, all these pieces, complex. Part of that complexity is it takes time. Dr. Wright talks often, it's not a Mississippi miracle, it's a Mississippi marathon, right? And we look at that data point last year and we say, wow, like what'd they do? And we chase those data points. And actually in Mississippi, that was 10 years of work to get to that data point, right? But we don't pay attention to all that work that goes in. That's the same story as Denver 15 years ago, or Chicago, or Washington, D.C., or Tennessee. Every time where we see data pop, not just one exceptional data point, right? We can walk you around Michigan today. We do this at Teach for America all the time. Organizations take you into a classroom or a school and say, look at this school, look at this teacher, the exception. But the exception doesn't scale or sustain in ways that can reach all kids. We're talking over a million students, over 100,000 kids. This is a very complex human-centered system. And if, to Mike's point, if we don't implement, if we don't first point the policy, point the activities, point the resources in the right direction, but it's not just enough to do that for a year or 2 years. You have to do that for 10 years. Dr. Leverett, you just said you have a 5-year strategic plan. I think a big crisis in our education system right now is if I read that strategic plan, I bet most of us would bet on it. The question is, can you make sure that you as a superintendent, the key school leaders in that plan, the key teacher leaders up and down those classrooms, that those folks are there for 5 years to do the work at a high level so that you can actually build, sustain, learn, adapt, improve for kids in a consistent way, and that 3 years from now we're not doing a new 5-year strategic plan. That's not just at Pontiac schools, that's at the state of Michigan.
Just kind of to react to that, and we talk about getting kind of on board with a plan and sticking to it. And I would argue that Michigan, being a largely purple state, is at a disadvantage in that, a blue state, Massachusetts, has a very dedicated direction in terms of where they're going. Mississippi, a red state, has a very clear direction. Michigan has been subject to a pendulum swing. We have seen, a big push. We're going to hold every third grader back, to, now we're not going to do it. And then, we have, teacher accountability, and now we're not going to do it. And we have these swings, and we don't have everybody in the same boat rowing in the same direction is what the problem is. And our structure doesn't allow for that. Our structural system has a system where we have a superintendent that is chosen by a board that is elected separately from the governor. That is a disjointed system that Launch Michigan would describe it in their writing. We need to unify this system. Business Leaders for Michigan yesterday just released their report, and that was one of their top education requirements, was that we need to have everybody going in the same direction. And until we do, any reform we have is likely to be undone by a next administration. I think that's what's got everybody in Lansing right now kind of on pins and needles, is what's going to happen next year after the new governor is in office.
So that's some of the optimism that I would like to lift, because you talked about unification, you talked about stability and accountability. So those are 3 key words that I think that moving forward into the future and beyond, that we need to keep in conversations, keep a part of the narrative, because we know that we have several challenges in the state, but without unification and all of us coming together to say, you know what, we know what didn't work. Now we have a plan. We have leadership in place. We have lessened our teacher turnover, which is so very important in the education of our children. Those are the things that are really going to set some foundation for us moving into these next 10 years.
All right, that's excellent. And it leads on towards my second question. So COVID is, depending on how you measure it, 4 or 5 years in the past. So, you were talking about 10-year periods, and we're about halfway into that. In what ways do you think we're making progress? In what ways is it less so? And so if we're halfway through recovering from COVID, where do you see us 5 years from now? How do you get there? So what progress have we made? What's different now? Maybe what have we learned? And then how do you expect things to be different in that 10-year period that Armin was talking about?
Let's, I guess, go back 10 years. We've been talking about the teacher shortage crisis in Michigan. It's not a new phenomenon. It was telegraphed back as far as 2010, with the collapse of the Great Recession and the impact on school funding in Michigan, $470 per pupil cut in 2011. All of us that were in schools at that time faced that reality, and it altered negotiations. It altered teacher working conditions. It altered all of those things, and we see fewer people going into the profession. We see a higher turnover rate within the profession, an early retirement rate, and we see a leaky bucket. Those are things, Michigan has done a really phenomenal job over the last 5 years of filling that leaky bucket. We have a huge number of grow your own programs and alternative track programs that have started to fill that. But what we're seeing, though, is that we're not retaining those teachers. And unless we can retain those teachers, and to Armin's point, to implement a 10-year plan to be able to fill those gaps and get career people to be in those buildings for 10 years, You know, I was in a district where people were, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and, that's not the norm anymore. The turnover is happening, and to get out of that COVID slide, we need to start working together so that we can retain our superintendents, retain our principals, retain our teachers, so that they can implement a strategic plan.
Let's jump in here. At Teach for America, coming off of COVID, we shifted our agenda. You shared earlier that we support 800 educators today. We had that observation. We're an organization that has spent 35 years recruiting the very best out of college campuses to go into understaffed schools. Back in 2019, we had an epiphany that the same schools keep calling us and asking us for first-year teachers, and we said, well, what can you tell us about the person you just lost? Like, who are we filling? Well, whose role? Well, that teacher's been here for 7 years. They're a great teacher. The families love them, but they got picked off from Brenda Scott Academy, and they're up in Bloomfield Hills now, where they left the sector altogether. And we said, well, wait a minute. If we're losing teachers at the top of their game, and we're replacing them with first-year teachers, and I'm a big fan of first-year teachers. My wife's a teacher. Like, my parents were educators. We need first-year teachers in the system, but that's a bad trade for kids. It's a bad trade for that school. That's a bad trade for the first-year teacher who now steps into school and doesn't have a strong mentor, right? And by the way, that's not the way any high-performing organization would absolutely function in any other sector, right? The Detroit Lions right now are signing their very top-tier talent for 10-year contracts, 5-year contracts, because they want those top-tier players to be the exact people who are setting the standard for everybody else. We don't do that in education. We just move teachers around or move principals around or whatever. So we launched a program where we invest $75,000 into the retention of high-impact educators who are already there, who are doing great work, over 3 years. And here's what we found out. We're 5 years into this strategy in Detroit. We're 3 years into the strategy statewide, and the data that just came out in the spring, that's coming out now in the fall, trickling out in different forms, we're seeing that schools where we've been investing, UPrep schools, Detroit Public Schools, we're seeing some uptick there. Dr. Vidi's been in seat for 9 years with clear implementation of a strategy, right? With good materials. And it takes time for great teachers and leaders to implement that over time, and it shouldn't be surprising then that they've got 3 years in a row of uptick in their data. And if I were a betting person, I would say, hey, I'd bet big right now that district, you're going to start to see the data start to tip up. It's not just going to be linear. It's going to start to tip up even further, faster. And we're seeing that in other schools where we invest in Grand Rapids, in Lansing, in Traverse City, in Sault Ste. Marie, right? When you give teachers and leaders the time, space, resources, connections, and most importantly, back to the time to do their best work. But listen, we have to value educators. I'm all about the grow your own programs. I'm all about the stuff we're doing to, as you said, close the leaky bucket. But the teacher shortage we have in the state is a reflection of a bigger symptom of not valuing our educators, right? If you walk into a third grade classroom, the difference between a high quality educator who's been in seat over time versus one who's not is over $100,000 of earnings for a single kid. If I look at a classroom then, I am seeing millions of dollars of economic value to the state of Michigan in that classroom if we only invested in that teacher. And yet, being a teacher today in Michigan, you get paid 22% less than your academic peers in your undergrad classrooms when you're going to college. Students at Oakland University's campus today, right? A teacher coming out of the School of Ed, we're paying them in our society 25, 23% less than their peer that did engineering or accounting or something else, right? And yet we know the significant value of that teacher. I'm not here to fight for pensions, but in the same time, right, we sunset the pension system, so that was a great equalizer in the compensation system, so they don't have that anymore. Healthcare benefits, and the job's damn hard.
Yep.
It's really hard.
Right. So I agree with everything you said. I was a teacher for 10 years, so I get it. But one of the things that we must understand, and I'm a person that makes connections, so I'm going to keep making these connections throughout this conversation because teacher burnout is a real thing. We have dedicated staff that come to these classrooms every day. They have the resources that they need. They have everything that they need, but we must do a better job of the self-care of our teachers when it comes to the pay for our teachers. The health care costs continue to rise, and we are expecting them to come in and provide a high level of instruction, and many of them do on a daily basis. But again, it's, do I come into this stressful environment where I may feel like I'm not being valued because of my onboarding experience or for my lack of a variety of other challenges that teachers face on a daily basis. And it's not necessarily always about the pay, it's about how I'm feeling in this experience as I am educating the next generation of community leaders, the next generation of doctors, lawyers, teachers, etc. And there is so much that we put on our teachers' plates every single day. They take so much home with them because they do care so much about our children. But we have to stop and pause, and we have to look at what are we doing systemically to our teachers, and how do we pivot and make those changes, because they certainly deserve it.
And just one quick comment, and it's the secondary trauma. You know, the students are coming in with traumas. It's the teachers then that are experiencing those traumas by the students coming into their classroom, to kind of just add voice to what you were adding. So, sorry.
Yeah, I forgot what the question was, but this is a great conversation, so I'll just carry on from here. Yeah, one thing, I think we need to have more nuanced discussion about teachers and teacher policy and teacher pay. You know, one of the things that school districts do that make it more difficult for them to retain teachers is they pay them as if they're assembly line workers, and they're interchangeable widgets, and there's a single salary schedule, and they pay them all the same regardless of whether they're in a really high demand field or regardless of whether they're a rock star teacher, right? We pay them all the same. It's only based on years of experience and the education degrees that they've earned. That's it. So school districts would have an easier time retaining high performing teachers if they could pay teachers differently. If they could offer teachers who are doing really well higher pay, or they could attract teachers that are hard to find in certain areas with a bonus, starting bonus or something like that, or even higher pay. We basically don't allow a labor market to function properly when it comes to teachers. So I think schools need to think about being more flexible with the way that they compensate their teachers and reward high performing teachers and use that as a means to retain them, and also use increased pay as a way to attract teachers to areas that are hard to staff.
And I'll agree and I'll disagree. Ironically, I'm a graduate of Oakland University. I earned my PhD here, and my dissertation was actually on alternative pay for performance in Michigan. And I guess the lack of implementation when it went into effect with Section 1250 over the last 15 years or so, as we think about teacher performance, I think there's ways that we can create that incentive without doing it the way that Michigan did it in the past. And I think we need to learn from that. And kudos to Teach for America, Teach Michigan, for changing the way that they're implementing kind of teacher performance. And we're looking at it from a longevity perspective, and we're looking at a retention possibility here. And how can we create pay structures that will retain them? The single salary schedule was put in place to equalize inequalities between women and men, between whites and blacks. It was put in place to do that. And I think there's still a need for that kind of single salary schedule, locally negotiated, but at the same time, create some opportunities to do what Mr. Van Beek was talking about, alternative pay that we can add to, that we can create a system where it does equalize the pay across professions. So an accounting major isn't making $25,000 more than an education major when they graduate from Oakland University.
I do want to touch on something Mike shared. Maybe just let me zoom out for a second. Back to your question, what makes us optimistic? I got to just shout out Bridge for a second here. It matters that we're talking about this. I don't mean just in this small room of a handful of folks and all the folks online, but that, to your point, the gubernatorial candidates are talking about it. That's because the public has the information, and that's because we have journalists who are doing that work to put that information out. It really does matter. And I would tell you, again, back to every city and state that's made scalable, sustainable progress, education reporting has to be at the forefront of that. Sharing data. Our state has to be sharing data to the public, right? So folks know how to engage with their schools and engage with the accountability mechanisms that are their local school boards or their charter schools or whatever it is, so that parents aren't just running around finding a new school every time it doesn't work, that they can engage in the efforts, the collective efforts of improving their schools, right? But that starts with information and data. So a big shout out to Bridge and all the education reporters out there that are putting this out there. Back to the teacher piece, listen, like today 1.4 million kids are in school, right? This morning they went to school. And by the way, in a whole bunch of communities, school districts had to figure out how to do that through a ice storm, right? All right, so this is a really complex thing. 450,000 of those students are growing up in poverty, and those 450,000 students, when they look to their right and left in their classroom this morning, the kids around them are also growing up in poverty, right? And we know where poverty is dense, opportunity is limited. It's not just what's happening at school now, it's what's happening in the community. It's around mentors, it's around adults. The adults are doing the best they can in those communities, but we have a systemic issue of disinvesting into communities and therefore families for generations, right? If you look at the academic outcomes for those 450,000 students, they're half as likely to achieve math scores in 8th grade, 3rd grade reading scores, to be proficient, to be college ready on ACT or SAT. We are leaving as a state 450,000 kids systemically behind out of our economy every year. That's just real. That's just real. So we can talk about the proficiency rates, we can talk about where we're sliding, but there's actually a group of kids that we can focus on that, by the way, is not just Detroit or Flint or Ben Harbor. It's Kalkaska and Sault Ste. Marie, and it's northern western UP. It's all over the place in this state, right? This can be, back to the Purple solution, Purple State challenge, but also opportunity. This can be a bipartisan solution to invest in those kids. And to Mike's point, investing into educators doesn't just have to be about performance pay. What about incentives to ensure that the very best teachers in the state are in front of the kids that need them the most, right? Not that we incentivize teachers by paying them more to be, love the folks in Bloomfield Hills, but in Bloomfield Hills versus in Detroit, or in East Grand Rapids versus Grand Rapids, or in Grand Blanc instead of Flint, right? What if we said, actually, that job is harder, those students are further behind, they're stepping into schools, overcoming more barriers, we need the very best teachers to be in those buildings. Why are we not investing as a state, not just hoping that happens at the local school district level, but as a state in the workforce in front of those students? I just share, if we do that and do that over time, you're gonna see our state proficiency rates rise.
So I'll just add one more thing, because we do know and understand one of the things that was showed on the slide was just because there's a certain demographic does not mean, let me be clear, does not mean that our students do not have the capacity to learn. It's quite the opposite. And so we have to get on board here with making sure that one of the missing elements is parent engagement. We must have parent involvement for our students to be able to succeed. I think that that's one of the things that is so important. We keep saying that it's a challenge. Our parents, they won't come to the parent-teacher conference. We have these challenges, but we have to make sure that we continue to educate and inform our parents. So this Mississippi data, this Mississippi Marathon, I've run a number of marathons, so I know what it means to be tired, to have your head down. Like, I don't think I can go on, but we still here, Michigan. We still here. And so we have all the smart people. We have the tools and the resources. So let's go to work. So we're not sitting here making excuses, because we know what our charge is. And that Mississippi data, that's a challenge. That's a call to action for us.
The other piece too, this is going to go against optimism, but kind of a complaint about what happened this year is, our leaders in Lansing, they need to make sure that they're helping the school districts be successful, and not passing a budget until after October 1 is not helping our superintendents or our school boards make educated decisions about where to put the funding in the school so that it has the best opportunity. So I think there's a couple pieces that are outlying there that we need to kind of hit on too. So we need to hold our elected leaders accountable too.
I love this conversation, and I actually love that we're forgetting what the original question was. That's fantastic. This is a great
Something about COVID.
It was about COVID. That's okay. So focusing in on literacy and reading proficiency for a sec, because a lot of what Mike and Isabel were looking at is reading and proficiency scores. Focusing in on that, first of all, is that the right focus for the state? And second of all, as you look at the different suggested solutions for improving our literacy rates, what do you think?
I think one of the things that I guess we're congratulating Bridge Magazine for their reporting. It's wonderful reporting. The data's phenomenal. Mike has done a fantastic job of democratizing the data for the masses in Michigan. But we also need to do some educating too, because we're using M-STEP scores to determine third grade reading. And we're talking about reading at grade level versus proficiency, and they're two different things. And we're using the same test to try to do both. And Chris Janzer and his team at the Michigan Department of Education do a wonderful job with accountability. But at the same time, the local assessments that teachers are using need to be, I guess, leaned in on, because I think what we're doing here is we're conflating proficiency and grade level reading. And I think they're both important, but at the same time, we need to make sure what we're looking at is the same information.
And from a practical standpoint, you want to teach a child to be a better reader, then read. You want to teach them to be able to comprehend, whether we're talking about letters essentials, phonemic awareness. We can get bogged down in what that means and what people think about what the research is. You want to teach a child to read, then give them more text to read and have those high-level conversations with them and challenge them. So I think that I certainly believe strongly that is the right conversation to have at this time where we're at in the state of education. Yes, we must be talking about those literary elements, but if we're talking about lifelong learners and lifelong education, it really is, for me, as simple as that. We have to provide those opportunities for our students to be engaged in literature at very high levels, and to provide them those opportunities for the discourse and all of those things that go along with it, along with having the opportunity to write. So those things go hand in hand. And the letters training, we've had a number of teachers in our district that have participated in the letters training. So I think that those are essential to what we want our students to be. When we talk about Michigan being a top 10 in 10, we're not going to be a top 10 in 10 unless Pontiac is in the race. And so we have to make those considerations. And so here we are. But again, for us, it is so very important.
Yeah, I'd say literacy and math are the right things to focus on. They're the building blocks of education. Now, let's not kid ourselves and think that those are all that we need to focus on, right? There's lots of other issues, lots of, one of the themes throughout this event, I think, has been education is really complex and dynamic and difficult, right? So that's all true, but we do need to have some measures, some way to measure the performance of our schools, and I think those are the ones that make the most sense. And the good news is, especially with reading, we know what works. We've seen it done. We've seen states turn around their reading scores, and students are performing better as a result of it. So we know what works. We can do it. We just need to implement it.
Just a caveat on just what Mr. Van Beek was saying. The politics can't be involved in the reading decisions, and that's really the what we're seeing in some states. Mississippi did it, they had a unified system, but there are other states that are going down the science of reading that are politicizing it. If you look at Kansas, they're asking for the syllabus of reading, instructors at the universities to make sure that they're only teaching one way of reading. And I think we need to be very careful that we don't kind of lock in that there is only one way to teach reading. I think there is best practices that can be implemented, and I think having 5, 6 different ways to do it that are proven, that are research-based, but not prescribing from a political viewpoint the way that something should be done. I think we have to be very careful that we don't do that pendulum swing that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, I just go back to say yes, like the focus on literacy is important, and focus is important for the state to say, here's what we're gonna focus on, here's where some accountability or resources might be invested. That's gonna trickle down, and that's gonna focus activities, resources, time, efforts up and down the system, right? When we can't talk about third grade literacy without talking about early childhood education. You can't talk about third grade literacy without talking about chronic absenteeism. You can't talk about third grade literacy without talking about quality materials, not just in schools, but at home, right? All these things start to play out if you have a focus, right? And the state's role in what is a highly decentralized education system is to create a focal point where folks can rally and to hold it stable. Now, I would just share the one thing that I worry about is our schools do still have to see the whole child. And that doesn't only mean reacting to the whole child need, but also saying what is it going to be to what's true about being a kid in Michigan. I have this like kick I'm on right now of CTE is a thing that we're going to see a lot of focus on. How do we make sure CTE is for every kid? Yeah. What would it be like to have a Michigan where every single kid before they graduate high school participates in building a car, right? So that every kid tries it out, right? It's not just the kids who opt into it or opt out of the general education building when they're in high school, but every kid's exposed to it, just like every kid should be able to read, just like every kid should be able to, I think in Michigan should be able to swim. I think every kid in Michigan should be able to ride a bike. Like, I can go down this list, but what does it mean to be a kid in Michigan these days? And then how do we give the educators the resources and the time to go make that experience real? And that starts obviously with every kid should be able to read.
It also is, our structural system is really messed up. I said earlier about the difference between the governor and the state superintendent. They were not on the same page over the last several years. It was very obvious as we look at what was happening politically between the two of them, within the same party basically, is what I would argue. But the other component of this is just how we organize schools in Michigan. We have 2 departments of education right now. We have MyLeap, which is the new department that handles higher education, out of school time and early education. MDE handles our K-12 education. Our adult ed is over at Leo. Our workforce is over at Leo. We have this really disjointed system where nobody is even in the same building having the same conversation. And we're talking about cradle to career. So if we talk about CTE, the importance of CTE is that it's not just about career or college, it's career and college as we think about this. The other piece too, to push back a little bit on Mississippi a little bit, I haven't been at a party lately where people are worried about their kids getting into Ole Miss. If we think about this, our parents in Michigan, our parents in California, our parents in Virginia, they want their kids to go over to the University of Michigan. A flagship university across the country, and Oakland University, proud alum, proud parent as well. But as we think about this, though, there's a distinction. We've got the folks from MCAN in the room here. We talk about college attainment. We have a goal. We have 60 by 30. We need to be rowing in that direction. Mississippi is at like 33% if we look at college attainment. So, we need to get kids to, access, persist, and graduate from college and career opportunities so they can make a living.
Which is a great segue to my next question, which is, we seem to be generally in agreement that every kid should read, and I absolutely every kid should read. Talk a little bit about what are our aspirations for that kid's literacy? What's the purpose of that? Where does that literacy lead kids? I think we all agree every kid should be able to read, no question. What's the aspirational piece of that is part one. Part two, when should we expect that to start happening? So getting to the bridge pieces, we're looking at these scores slide. Okay, what are our aspirations and what's a reasonable timeline?
I've been talking too much, I apologize, but I'm a social studies teacher. I know we're here, we got Dr. Dulio, and the civic engagement piece of this is a key component of that. Reading leads to critical thinking. Reading leads to understanding our history. Reading leads to all of these critical components that creates lifelong learning so that we can have a civic dialogue, that we can have a civil dialogue, that we can have a democracy that is well educated and well informed so that we can make decisions about how we should organize our government.
I agree.
Yeah, I can't add anything better than that.
Yeah, that's really what it is all about, is being able to explore and experience life in a way that not having all of those attributes as a reader you're just simply not afforded. And so our students deserve all of those opportunities and more. And then the first part of your question, Dr. John, was how soon should that happen? And we know that we had the read by third grade, but we also have a pre-K through, you know, like you said, from cradle to career. Students know how to read by pre-K kindergarten. So that's when, for me, that should be the expectation, because we are continuously setting up, in my opinion, a system for failure when we say read by third grade and we're going to retain you. It is already too late by third grade. It was too late for us to do that. And again, we had all the resources throughout the state for training our teachers, and then we wanted to retain. So I think that we have some lessons to be learned from that, and I say that we back it up in terms of what are our expectations for our students to be able to read. They can read and comprehend earlier than third grade.
Our aspirations, and when can we expect to attain them?
Let me jump into when we expect to see some movement on this data point. And I just want to share, you know, the part of the complexity of politics and versus long, complex change is a whole bunch of things that I think the legislature and the governor have done over the last 4 to 8 years. I would say set the foundation. And so would it surprise me if in a year or two you start to see some scalable uptick in proficiency rates when there's greater implementation of the science of reading, materials are in place, there's been deeper investment on retaining educators in recent years. I would expect to see in districts and schools that are doing that work that you're going to start to see that uptick. And candidly, whoever's next in office is going to claim credit for all that, right? Which of course they will. And we would make a big mistake as a state if we said, "Gosh, what did we do in the last 6 months that resulted in that?" We've had significant movement on equitable funding. This is now a priority. For a long time as a priority for Democrats. It's a priority for everybody now, right? I mean, I don't see anybody saying, yeah, actually, we should fund all kids equally. I see us saying more often, there are students who we know need greater funding than other students, and that's taking consideration poverty, it's taking consideration English language learners and special education and rural communities where there's greater distance to travel, so transportation costs, right? We have made significant advancements as a state on that in the last 4 years. And the Republican legislature, the House, led efforts alongside the Democratic Senate and leadership to lock that in this last budget. That's a big deal. That's a big deal, right? And 4 years from now, 3 years from now, when we start to see those results, I would say, yeah, educators have more resources. They have the resources they need. The focus is starting to get clear. I wish we wouldn't say, hey, we're going to implement science of reading as a state and you've got 3 years to do it. I wish we would have just said, hey, we know that works. To your point, Mike, we know what works. Why didn't we say everybody has to do that by next year? Let's get going, because it's going to take you a year or two to figure it out and get the training done. It's not like you're just going to turn it on. So why not get that process going? But I think we're seeing some progress in the foundation being built in the right ways, a focus on quality, a focus on outcomes. The resources are in place, and I'd expect to start to see some results soon, so long as we stay the course.
Yep, that's good.
And I can't agree more with that stay the course mentality, that, you know, this pendulum swing that we've seen a couple times, and you know, we've gone from Granholm to Snyder to Whitmer, you know, be it, you know, Mike Duggan, be it Jocelyn Benson, be it John James, whoever is going to be governor next year or in 2 years or a year and a half or whatever it's going to be. I'm having a brain fart up here. The pendulum can't be let's throw it all out because it was the last governor's idea. You know, things like 60 by 30 need to be maintained. Things like educator retention have to be maintained. Things like educator pensions need to be maintained so that we can retain teachers in the classroom. So they're just kind of highlighting that piece, that we can't just kind of go back and forth like we have.
And I think it's reasonable to say that that's one of the themes that we see out of the Center for Civic Engagement. So I go back to who is leading this today, and Galileo Institute for Teacher Leadership and the Center for Civic Engagement. both have those as themes. One of the themes in the reporting that we see is the interplay between the chronic absenteeism that we see and a cultural change in how people view education in schools. And I'm wondering what's the path forward on that, because, you know, duh, if the kid is not in school, they're not going to learn that day's lesson. That seems pretty manifest. But what's the long game for addressing absenteeism by looking at the way culture influences whether a kid shows up for school?
Well, I don't know the answer, but I do know that it's not as bad, the chronic absenteeism is not as bad in every state. So there are things we can learn from other states that have recovered more quickly from the COVID era and have more children attending school regularly than we do in Michigan. So I don't know the answer. I think a part of it was related to COVID. You know, during COVID, schools told parents it's okay to be remote and do remote learning and be virtual. And so I'm not surprised that a lot of parents, it seems, have lessened the value on getting their kid to school every day. So how you educate parents about the value of that, I'm not sure. Maybe if their student is going to get held back if they don't read at grade level, maybe that would incentivize some parents to make sure their kids are in their classroom more regularly. I'm not sure, but I'd be interested to hear what you think.
It's an ongoing challenge, and it's very concerning because you have these touch points, right? So you have, if I'm absent 3 days, 5, 10, 15, 20, that's too long. I heard a gentleman up here earlier that said, you know, I missed in my whole K-12 career, I might have missed 18 days, and he was sick the first 7 days of school. So we're just letting, you know, we have to change the attendance policy. There can be detrimental outcomes when we don't know the reasons why our students are not in school. So we know that our average daily attendance, okay, 75, 80%. No, we need 100% of our students in school 100% of the time. Unless they're sick and they come to school and they have a doctor's note, we need to be making those phone calls. We need to be vigilant about and that accountability about why our students are not at school. And if they're not, then we need to know why, because we just cannot let students, and that's another, you know, long hauler of COVID, so to speak, that across the country, that students are not coming to school. So if they're not coming to school, a lot of other things are impacted, because if you miss 1 day of school, or if you pull your child out for a doctor's or dentist appointment, those are all things that negatively impact their educational experience. So it is a huge challenge that we have to continue to talk about and bring into the room. And I don't have the answer to that. But again, we have to make sure that we educate and inform on why your child should be in school every day, and the students and parents know what are the repercussions for me not sending my child to school.
And I think it's twofold to piggyback on that. One is, what are we doing with the kids in school? And I heard, you know, the superintendent, you know, of Michigan say this earlier this year. It's about seat time. I heard someone say it earlier that we want butts and seats.
Right.
But it's not about butts and seats.
Right.
It's about creating experiential learning. You know, it's about creating opportunities for students to learn inside and outside of the classroom, making the kids want to come to school, because the experiences that they're having in school are engaging, that the experiences that they're having are going to prepare them for an opportunity where they're sitting on stage in front of a group of people talking about education policy. Like, you know, we want them to be prepared to be able to do that. You know, in my classroom, I remember, you know, I had great content in my economics courses, but it was when I took my kids to the Federal Reserve and they did their own presentations that they actually got, you know, the bang for their buck. And they never missed a day when you have a field trip. You ever notice that? You know, when kids are going and doing things and they're excited about learning, they're there. You know, there's just creative ways that we could do that. The other piece too is, you know, every school district in Michigan has to have attendance policy. You know, 3 days unexcused, 10 days. You know, those are all policies that are put in place. it's how we communicate it. RAND just came out with a study last week where they were talking about touch points and communications, and they found that by texting parents at certain time periods of the day that they were getting better reactions. You know, the phone calls were getting no reactions because nobody's answering their phone. When was the last time that you answered your phone from an unknown number? You know, just think about how we could implement things within schools to automate and communicate and sell the importance of being in school. Because if you're not in school, if you're not engaged, then it's going to lead, you know, and again, there's a larger political piece too of what we're seeing of like the anti-college, you know, kind of trickling down into the anti-school mentality that school isn't worth it, you know, and that's not the case. We know that, you know, students who graduate from college earn more and they're unemployed less. You know, how do we sell that and bring that back into the parent? Like, you know, your student, if they don't graduate from high school, you know, if they don't attend high school, they can't graduate. If they don't graduate, they can't go to college. If they don't go to college, they're not going to get a high-paying job. Those are things that we have to sell.
I have 3 kids of my own, 2nd, 6th, and 8th, and so anybody who has kids at home knows that you're in these conversations often. And I always am like stunned when I have to say, you know, it's the law. I always blame it on the law. You have to go to school. It's the law. And
I could go to jail if I don't
the
send
only
you to
guy
school.
by that.
I know some teenagers that might pull that lever.
I do think to Dan's point, I think there's 2 pieces of this. One is schools have to call kids in, right? And that's the customer service at the at the front office. If you ever show up to a school and as a parent you don't feel welcome there, well, that's going to be a place I'm not all that interested in sending my kid there. I actually think we haven't talked about this yet, but just to weave this in, I think cell phones have become such a problem. We know that they're a problem in learning, but I would share they're actually this whole idea of like parents communicating with their kids directly through a cell phone and not having to work through an office anymore, and therefore what that's done to the school culture of offices not being seen or administrative staff not being seen as having a customer service orientation because they're kind of cut out of that process. You know, the days of me calling and having to talk to the front office, administrator and say, hey, can you send a note to my kid versus just texting? I'm like, I need to get it back to the place where we're in that relationship with the school.